So I'm sure you've all seen him. The random LFG guy constantly freezing unstops and overloads, screwing them out of their stuns and making them infinitely harder to kill. But today, I'm going to show you how to leverage Stasis against champions, so you can effectively stun them and reset their timers with Stasis without interfering with your team. So first, we're just going to talk about Stasis and champions as a whole. Whenever any champion ends its stun duration, it becomes immune to stuns for a short time. Champions also regain their abilities during this time, meaning Unstoppables will rush you down and Overloads will start teleporting all over the place. You can remove the healing ability of Overload champions by hitting them with Overload damage during this time, but this is the only thing you can do to them. This grace period can be really dangerous, since both Unstoppable and Overload champions regain all of their abilities, but you can't stun them. Oftentimes, they'll start rushing you down and you'll have no way to deal with them. These grace periods are pretty long by default, but get even longer in Master and Grandmaster content. Getting the timing down for certain weapons is crucial here to minimize the amount that they heal. Champions also sometimes regain a portion of their passive abilities while frozen. And champions also can in fact be stunned while frozen, and will remain stunned when they unfreeze. When a champion freezes, it both unstuns the champion and cancels this grace period. This is why Stasis can be so annoying against champions for your team. When you freeze a stun champion, it becomes unstunned, which can really screw up your team's damage since Unstoppable champions regain their damage resistance, and Overload champions regain part of their healing. However, Stasis also cancels the champion's grace period, allowing you to plan out your freezes to avoid having to deal with the grace period. Stasis is a double-edged sword. Without the proper knowledge of how to use it against champions, you could hinder your team by stopping them from being able to properly damage champions. However, with the proper knowledge, a Stasis player is absolutely invaluable in Nightfalls and Master Raids, since they can completely eliminate the danger of champion grace periods and make it much safer to kill champions in sticky situations. In this video, I'm going to go over all three champion types and show you how you can deal with them, as well as how not to accidentally unstun them and screw your team up. So first, we're going to start with barrier champions. Barrier champions are the simplest to deal with on Stasis, and are one of the reasons why Stasis is so powerful right now in Nightfalls. The long and short of it is, freezing a barrier champion with Stasis will cause it to be unable to deploy its barrier, granting Stasis intrinsic anti-barrier, and making it the only subclass type that effectively comes with a champion mod. This is balanced out by the fact that light-based subclasses gain the ability to break match game shields. Light subclasses break shields, and Stasis breaks barrier champions. In fact, it wouldn't really surprise me to see if the other two darkness elements have some sort of soft champion stuns in some capacity, to balance out the fact that they can't break shields. Since they also don't gain any buffs when they become unstunned, barrier champions are completely safe to freeze in every scenario. Instead of just telling you to freeze them though, I'm going to outline the best ways in the game to deal with these champions without a mod. So first we're going to go over grenades. Technically, all three Stasis grenades can stun barrier champions, but Glacier grenades only provide a single stun, and their cooldown is too long to be used repeatedly. Dust Fields are generally the best at dealing with barriers by default because they don't require an exotic and have a very fast cooldown. If you throw a Dust Field at a barrier champion, it'll be repeatedly frozen as long as it stays within the volume, meaning that as long as the Dust Field's still up, you can be free to shoot the champion knowing the shield won't come up anymore. Dusk Fields have a 24-second base cooldown and 100 discipline, meaning you can do this really often on any Stasis subclass. Cold Snap grenades are up next, and I'd really only recommend these on a Shadebinder when you're running Osmiomantic gloves. Cold Snaps instantly freeze targets, so the most obvious way to stun a barrier champion with one is to simply throw the grenade on the ground before the champion pops up its shield. Although this does work, Cold Snaps have a pretty long cooldown, so this usually isn't very practical, unless you have Osmiomantic gloves that is. Osmiomantic gloves can return grenade energy when you land hits with Cold Snap grenades, and this can range from anywhere between 25 and 50% per hit, and champions grant 50%. If you throw a Cold Snap and it directly impacts the champion, it'll bounce off, land on the ground, and then hit them with a Seeker, meaning you can double hit an enemy with a Cold Snap. If you do this, you'll get 100% grenade energy back every time you throw one of these, as long as it actually hits the champion with both the impact and the Seeker. This means you can repeatedly freeze a barrier champ while your teammates lay into it, or while you alternate between Cold Snaps and heavy shots. Cold Snaps can also freeze a barrier champ with their shield up as long as the Seeker spawns inside of the shield. So long as the grenade makes direct impact, it'll always freeze the champion, even if the shield pops up for a second. Bleak Watchers on Warlock are also a great way to stun barrier champions. If you throw one near barrier champion, it'll repeatedly freeze it before the barrier appears, allowing you to effectively stun a champion for 30 whole seconds with a single grenade. I wouldn't recommend using Bleak Watchers against the other two champion types though, because they need very precise timing to be disabled, and Bleak Watchers can be a little too trigger happy for the job. I would only use them on barriers. Next up is Agriceptor's Catalyst. Tons of you have probably used this one before. It's pretty simple. If you turn on Agriceptor's Catalyst and shoot a barrier champion, it'll continually freeze it as long as you deal damage, preventing it from putting up its shield. If you just keep laying on the trigger, it'll be stun locked by the freeze. Next are the Stasis Supers. All three of the Stasis Supers can stun barrier champions. Glacial Quake and Silence and Squall are pretty simple. For SNS, just throw it at the champ, and for Quake, use the right click, which goes through the barrier champion shield since the crystals are created on the ground under the shield. Winter's Wrath is also pretty simple, but there's a much better way to use it than just shooting a full burst and right-clicking like most people do. Winter's Wrath fires 2 bursts of Stasis Seekers, consuming a chunk of super energy for each Seeker. If you only need one Seeker, like in the case of our Barrier Champion, you can cancel the second one by pressing the Fire button, and then holding down the Shatter Pulse button. This will cancel the second burst of Stasis Seekers with a Shatter Pulse, not only increasing your rate of fire, but also allowing you to shatter enemies more often. But it also prevents you from wasting super energy on the second burst when you don't need it. You can repeatedly do this against Barrier Champions to deal some hefty shatter damage and keep them stunned the whole time. Next we have Stasis Melees. As you may know, you can actually freeze a Barrier Champion while its shield is up, but you have to do it from within the shield itself. In a pinch, you can slide inside the shield and throw a Stasis Melee to take down the shield. I don't recommend relying on this often, and instead using it as a last resort, because it's fairly wasteful since the champion has likely already regenerated a lot of its health, and you may just be better off backing up and trying again with a more efficient method. Finally, you can also stun Barrier Champions with rapid-fire fusion rifles with Chill Clip. Unfortunately, I don't own a Chill Clip Riptide, so I can't really show this in gameplay, but take my word for it. If you fire 2 fusion shots at the champ with more than half your magazine left, it'll freeze it and prevent its shield from coming up. Overall, Barrier Champions are very safe to stun with Stasis, and I'd recommend practicing on these before you move up to the other two. Next, we're going to go over Unstoppables, since they're the middle ground for difficulty. Unstoppables normally have 70% damage resist while unstunned, and when stunned, that damage resist will fall off. Something unique about Unstops is that they're the only champion type that regain 100% of their ability when frozen. When Overloads are unstunned by freeze, they only partially regain their healing ability, as we'll see in the next section, and Barrier Champions lose their ability altogether when frozen, but Unstoppables retain all 70% of their damage resist when frozen. As you can see in the background, even stunning the champion while frozen leaves him at 70% damage resist, and once he shatters, he loses that resist even though the stun came well before he was unfrozen. This means that you're going to have to be extra careful about shattering the champion before attempting damage, since you're going to deal less damage while he's frozen, stunned or not. Against unstoppable champions, Stasis can be an extremely powerful asset. Unstoppable champions are known for their ability to rush down your team and almost instantly kill them. They retain this ability even during their grace period, so in close range, it's critical that you can properly execute freezes to ensure that they can't take advantage of the grace period. Luckily, once they're frozen, they don't regenerate health or anything, so once they're frozen, you can take as much time as you need stunning and shattering them. I would highly recommend using a more sustainable option to freeze them, such as Cold Snap Grenades on Osmiumates Gloves or a Chill Clip Fusion Rifle, since you may need multiple stuns to kill them due to Unstoppables typically being tanky enemies like Ogres or Phalanxes. You don't need a Rapid Fire Fusion for Unstoppables or Overloads, since you don't have to be as fast as with Barrier Champions, so you can use a Deliverance or Burden of Guilt as well. I would recommend throwing a Cold Snap or firing your first Chill Clip shot right when the champion begins lifting up their head after the stun. This way, you'll give your team time to do as much damage as possible and freeze them immediately after the damage resist returns when the stun runs out. The most important thing to remember is to time your freeze so it lands immediately after the stun wears off. This will make it so you freeze them during a time when they've already regained their damage resist, so any teammates trying to shoot them would have had their damage blocked by the champion anyway, freeze or not. The worst thing to have happen is to block a Parasite shot that would have dealt full damage to the champion, so make sure you land those freezes after they regain the damage resist. I would practice some unstoppable stuns before moving on to overloads, but once you get the hang of it, dealing with unstoppable champions and Grandmaster content will be much easier when you don't have to deal with the annoying grace period that they have. And finally, overload champions. Overload champions are by and large the most complicated champion to deal with due to the fact that they regain a portion of their healing ability while frozen. You'll need to be very precise with your timings in order to stun them properly, or else they'll heal huge chunks of health every time you freeze them. I really wouldn't recommend using Chill Clip Fusion Rifles against these guys, but rather would recommend Cold Snap Grenades on Osmiumates Gloves, as they give you the perfect amount of wiggle room and precision that you need to execute the following combos. As shown on screen, in addition to becoming unstunned, Overload champions regain roughly half their healing capacity while frozen, meaning you're going to need very quickly stun and shatter them to prevent them from regaining any health while you reset their grace period. The key to this is throwing out a Cold Snap to directly impact them right when their head starts to lift, and starting to activate your Overload weapons mod while it bounces off a champion. The moment you see them freeze, you're going to want to hit them with the stun. Getting the timing down for certain weapons is crucial here to minimize the amount that they heal. Luckily, you only really need to hit them with the Overload stun. Since Overload champs have no significant damage resist while frozen, your teammates can continue damaging the whole time, and they'll shatter the champion automatically while you stun it. It can be difficult at times to manage Overloads, but once you get the hang of it, it's an extremely powerful asset that you can add to your team, since Overloads have a bit of a reputation for running for cover during their grace period and healing back up to full while you can't advance. This stasis tech keeps them out in the open and stops them from regaining their teleport ability during the grace period. Before I close, I'm going to go over a couple of interesting things you can do with stasis against champions. First is champion stun artifact mods. If an enemy is frozen by stasis, you can repeatedly stun them over and over, even though they'll be considered stunned after the first time and remain stunned when the freeze breaks. This means that you can use artifact mods that require you to stun champions repeatedly. One good example is Revitalizing Blast, which would ignite champions when they're stunned. If you ever see a mod like that in rotation, it's a great time to pull out the Monarch in a stasis build, because you'll be able to spam those mods like crazy. Secondly, I'd like to talk about Bleak Watchers. Knowing champion spawn locations is pretty important for Bleak Watcher placement. You want to ensure that you place your turrets far away from any unstoppable or overload spawn points, since they can inadvertently unstun champions when you don't want them to. I usually place them behind objects that block their line of sight to the champion. So get out there and start practicing messing with champions on Stasis. It's not a skill I see very often, but it's an extremely useful one when mastered, especially on those close-range grandmasters like Fallen Saber, where a Grace Period champion is extremely dangerous. If you'd like to chat or play with me, or need any help with the game, please check out my clan's Discord in the description. If you like what I do, please consider liking and subscribing to help grow my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.